This should take, when I timed it at home, about 50 minutes. It'll probably be a little slower with you all out there. Doesn't have a title. When I was writing it, I just called it Claudia Emerson, or Claudia. And I realized as I was finishing it, it was something like appreciation, explication, as elegy, and that's not easy to put into a title. Also, I was trained so long to refer to an author by just their last name. That seemed wrong to me. So you're going to hear just Claudia's first name throughout this. Rereading Claudia Emerson's work through the spring and early summer was my attempt to come to terms with her death from cancer last year at the sadly early age of 57. Come to terms is a cliche, and an anodyne one at that, to avoid saying I still expect to see Claudia in this room where I spent more time with her than anywhere else. I have not let myself realize, except at the obvious intellectual level, that I will never laugh with her again, never again be amazed by a new poem, never again be greeted by her high, delighted, two-syllable, "Hey!" at seeing me, her arms flung wide for a hug. The hardest issue I had in writing about Claudia was using the past tense. I kept writing is and had to go back and change each is to was, and each correction was a re-realization and a renewed sorrow. Claudia's work is imbued with death, and it was from the beginning. That sounds grim, but Claudia's work is not. Claudia was too engagingly thoughtful and too vibrant an artist to be anything but exhilarating to read. Her obsessive meditations on death provide us with an unfolding set of instructions on how to mourn her, or larger than that, how to mourn and how to use the inevitability of death to press ourselves more deeply into what she called the invariable bliss of what is. In Pharaoh, her first book, 29 of the 33 poems use a variant of the word death or contain a death. I doubt that ratio changes much over her next 7 books. What the word love is to Shakespeare, dark, swoon, and faint are to Keats, son to Emily Dickinson, and lad to A.E. Housman, death is to Claudia, death and its concomitants, abyss, void, emptiness, vanish, disappear, abandon. These are the words of grieving, the words of loss, the words that fill the non-space where brother, father, friend, and her husband's first wife have gone, and into which Claudia herself will follow. Her subject and her talismanic words do not vary much, but her vision enlarges over the 8 books, becoming wider and deeper, more deeply investigated, and more lyrically brilliant as she neared her end. In Claudia's first 2 books, a tendency toward drama and prodigal language occasionally burst into full Gothic bloom, probably growing out of her upbringing and young womanhood in rural Virginia, where cruelty and death are near for those who live directly off the land, and hardship turns people harsh. I don't know about that, Aunt Kate. I don't remember the Bible like you do. I would tear your tongue out like a bloody root, she tells me, but I am tired. Lays down her head in her narrow lap. A hymn trembles, rises from her thighs. Shall we gather at the river? Or is it that people are harsh because the land itself is harsh, marked with overgrown graves and afflicted with kudzu, poison ivy, and tornadoes? He wants to visit the old place, and so we go with shovel and rake to repair the graves that are all we own of that slow ruin. Kudzu pulls the house down on itself, and poison ivy has settled into a deepening depression. He was just about your age. He buries her again. Again, he feels that old fear, not of any visible abyss, but of this furious recurring worm, dust-gorged and pulsing, and its slow, decomposing downward suck. The high-flown rhetoric that equates the dust-gorged tornado with death evokes one of Claudia's earliest and deepest influences, William Faulkner. But it's hard not to think of another Gothic writer that she doesn't mention, her fellow Virginian Edgar Allan Poe and his famous poem, The Conqueror Worm. The angels, all pallid and wan, uprising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy man and its hero, the conqueror worm. Or perhaps the influence is Poe's most immediate source, Shakespeare. Be not self-willed, for thou art much too fair to be death's conquest and make worms thy own. Though worms as a gaudy metaphor for death goes back at least to the book of Job and the prophets of the Babylonian exile, to modern ears the metaphor sounds archaic and overheated. Claudia returns to it twice more in Pharaoh, once discussing an alakite, an actual earthworm, in bait. But when you slide the earthworm like a stocking over the sharp toe, the smooth curve of the bloodless hooked leg, tell me again how the bloodless vessel feels no pain as you pierce the first of its abundant hearts. I love the exactitude of the metaphor, the insinuating voice, and the nearly exuberant glee of the poem's small horror. In Phoenix, the maggot returns when a woman commits suicide for reasons unknown but guessed at. The whys are all supposed and of a kind: love lost, what she fought in the mirror, the change of life. Perhaps there was no one thing that nestled her finger neat against the trigger that drove the bullet in the brain that must, at last, the hair she'd worn the same way since 1963. We pray over an urn, even her ashes clean, contained. She would, by request, cheat the slower worm. The poem ends with a hope for resurrection from the ashes that is, I'm afraid, unconvincing. Claudia imagines her friend driving some long, fast car on a road, writhing in light shed like snow skin from a perfect moon. Flying, flying, she is swaddled in white, the ragtop down, her head thrown back, the wind fine in her hair begins to burn. But she only laughs, floors it, will be gone before the fire consumes itself in the void from which she rises. We understand the poet's desire to imagine her friend alive, rising from the void, but there's nothing beyond wishing to support the desire, so the poem's final imagery feels overwrought and not fully thought through. John Milton famously proclaimed the translation of Lycidas into heaven, a hope appropriate and understandable for a Christian believer writing in a Christian age. But in Claudia's early poetry, there is no established faith or ideology to draw on. There is no cross, Kaaba, no bow tree, or Ganges to be found. And if we are dubious of Alfred Lord Tennyson's lovely and haunting effort to declare Arthur Hallam's spiritual immortality, strange friend, past, present, and to be, loved deeplier, darklier, understood. In our even more skeptical age, we also have to be wary of Claudia's imagined resurrection of her friend. Her artistic vision is not yet commensurate with the transcendence the poem longs for. despite the author's attempt to console herself by portraying her friend's lost vitality. By her own admission, Claudia wrote almost exclusively elegies, and thus she wrote almost always about death and death's aftermath, lamenting, remembering, memorializing, consoling. As the critic Gerald E. Hoggle writes, the elegist seeks to contextualize and possibly grant larger and lasting meaning to a person or occasionally a group who has passed away. In a 2013 interview with Susanna Mintz, Claudia said much the same thing. I don't know that I have written many poems outside the loose category we can consider elegy. The elegist is an architect, the sort who constructs rooms and who constructs memory and memorial. In Going Once, Going Twice, the 9th poem in Pharaoh, Pharaoh, Claudia writes about the auctioning of her family's possessions, a subject she returns to again and again, and she embraces one of the elegist's most important obligations, to remember the names of the dead. My father bids and buys for next to nothing the gourd he says they used to gather eggs. He peers into its emptiness, tells me he remembers growing it, its seed. The cousins seek him out, call him to come into the bottomless house where they've discovered a shoebox filled with tintypes, portraits all in black and white. He is, after all, the last surviving memory of those who have come this close to some ancestral abyss, where graves, displaced names assume again the latent image, or abstracted, time-bound. He peers into the faces, over the rant of the auctioneer who pleads again, are we all in and all done? My father surprises us and himself as names rise to the tongue, so long since they've been called, it as if here, at the auctioned kitchen table, he chooses them, christens the late, Ruth, Maud, Julia, Kate. It is easy in this poem to hear writers that Claudia called influences along with Faulkner, Robert Frost, Flannery O'Connor, Eudora Welty, Robert Penn Warren, and James Dickey, as well as her friends Ellen Bryant Voigt and Betty Adcock. But the poem tacitly admits that christening of the late is inadequate to the task of preserving them. Standing at the auctioned table, staring at the faces the cousins do not recognize, both father and daughter are shocked that he remembers the names. For the daughter, names are all they are. Saying Ruth, Maud, Julia, Kate, while important, does little to preserve their substance for the daughter or for us, the reader. I'm pointing out the limitations of these early poems not to denigrate Claudia's formative work, but to show what her fuller vision grew out of and how vastly her vision enlarged. They are fine poems, but they are also seedbeds for the more powerful poetry to come. The tornado, the fire, and the imagined afterlife will all return in later poems, and in each case they will be raised to a much higher level of artistry. But the conqueror worm, with its Gothic trappings, is gone for good. Elegy is one of the poet's traditional roles. I could use some water. The elegy is one of the poet's traditional roles, and it's also an obligation that Claudia's father, Claude, bestowed on her. Recurrence, a late poem from a sequence called Claude Before Time and Space, ends with Claude telling Claudia about his recurring dream after a brush with mortality. Claude is having a recurrent dream after the open heart surgery, and he tells it as though you too are having it, the one where the garden goes awry. Thank you, sir. Blooms out all wrong, deepening before you. Tomatoes where onions should be, crows there but shy, dirt on your hands as though you had something to do with it. And then you arrive at the place where it all begins to make sense again. Beans climbing the threads you pulled taut for them, potatoes neat in their beds. When you feel you could wake up, you do. Even this part he tills with his hands out, as though blinded, parting something invisible to you. The chaos of dying, the random legacy of seed. You will bear no children. In you he sees an end, and that's why you need to hear this. Claude will have no grandchildren to whom he can tell his understanding of chaos resolving into order. So he tells his daughter, the poet, and one of the traditionals of the poet, duties of the poet, is to preserve the past. Horace wrote that many a brave man lived before Agamemnon, but all lie buried, unwept and unknown in the long night, because they lacked a sacred bard. That's the Neil Rood translation. Or if you prefer a more high-flown version, there's Alexander Pope's unusually maladroit approximation of the verse. Vain was the chief's and sage's pride. They had no poet, and they died. In vain they schemed, in vain they bled. They had no poet, and are dead. When you read that, you read it like 3 times to think, Alexander Pope wrote that. No modern elegist worth her salt is going to be so buoyant as to declare herself a sacred bard, or be as self-assured as Shakespeare was about his ability to confer immortality on the dead. So long as men can breathe, our eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Though Claudia understood the limitations of the contemporary elegist, she also knew she could keep alive in memorable portraits some vestige of those she loved, which is, as Jehan Ramanzani points out in Poetry of Mourning, the modern elegy from Hardy to Heaney, one of the advantages the modern elegist has over her predecessors. As a genre, elegy, typically shaped and ordered grief, had abstracted and objectified the dead. Though intermittently impeded, elegiac mourners usually followed an effective course that led from anger and despair to consolation. Further, elegiac portraits of the dead concealed most blemishes. From Astrophel to Lycidas to Adonais, the dead were visible only through the thick shroud of pastoral codes and abstract ideals, much as mourners were audible only through conventional personae and formal lament. Hence, Auden complains that in Adonais, both Shelley and Keats disappear as people, but as the more systematic disciplinarity of modern institutions extended to the dead and their mourners, poets became ever more articulate about their intimate and contradictory feelings toward the dead, who become, in turn, more distinctive because of their complex portrayals. Has anybody ever heard the word disciplinarity before? That was a new one to me. Claudia created compelling portraits of her father, both late, as in Recurrence, and early, as in Nothing for the Salt, which begins with wonderfully cantankerous grumbling, both funny and painful. The cancers in his bladder of all places. If he has to have it, my father asked, why could it not be somewhere less shameful if such a place exists? A lung, perhaps. And I have long loved Cold Room, Claudia's portrait of her mother grieving for the imminent death of her son. And that's the first poem on your handout. And now, from now on, anything I quote that's long will be on the sheet. This is Cold Room. Her refrigerator full. My mother has stored some things in the cold of my brother's closed-off room. Christmas oranges in pears on the floor, the salt-cured ham that hung for a full year from the cellar rafters, cooked now and kept on the chest of drawers. He is far away and ill. She knows he will not come home anymore, suspects she will not see or hold him again in the flesh, allowed him now only in smiling photographs, undone by a voice thin on the phone. Late afternoons, she climbs the slow, complaining stairs with a platter and carving knife. She wears her winter coat, opens the door to his bed still made, stale light, the scent of ripe fruit and cold smoke. Here in the room, let go for this. She concentrates on carving, the meat so even and thin she can see through it to the blade. Its clean, practiced passage. Just so, she says, as though to no one, just so. The brother's bedroom has become the chilly, smoke-scented anteroom of death, nearly a classical Hades, and his stoic, practical mother is using it as overflow cold storage for Christmas, which she will celebrate with holiday fruit and smoked meat. But the careful slicing of the ham, cut so thin she can see the knife through the meat, expresses her rigidly controlled grief. Just so, she repeats, acknowledging unalterable fate and musing on the metaphor she knows she is enacting, death visible through translucent flesh. Late Wife, in which Cold Room appears, marks Claudia's maturation as an artist. Shedding her influences, she writes with a rich intellectual sense of an engaged thinker living in a contemporary world of skeptical limitations. In an interview, she admits to her own, there's another one that should be admitted. She admitted to her own reluctance to speak as herself for fear of revealing too much. But in Late Wife, she begins by addressing her husband's first wife, and she is not free to invent fictions about her or pretend to be privy to the dead woman's thoughts and feelings. The consistent thing, this is Claudia, through the whole book is the first person addresses you. And that was strictly because I didn't want to assume that I could write anything from my husband's first wife's point of view. I don't know anything about that, so I had to be me in the house with him and write about her. So in every sonnet, I'm juggling three people, basically. And it was really hard for me because all my poetic career, I have insisted to my students that I don't care what really happened. I don't care what really happened. I'm not interested in confession. I've never, ever done that. Now at age 45, I suddenly am compelled to write something true, which is very, very dangerous. This difficult realization turned Claudia from a good but often derivative poet, one who wrote rich, textured poetry that is often rural and fierce, but that was in the thrall of her masters, especially Faulkner, Frost, and O'Connor. When she began speaking as herself in the lyric first person, her confident and flexible voice gains power, intimacy, and death. Look at Homecoming from Secure the Shadow, a poem free of the Faulknerian language of the first two books. It's a poem whose subject matter could easily soar into melodrama. The new wife is looking at a video the late wife took of the husband arriving home, and the speaker, Claudia herself, is the present wife, viewing the scene from the perspective of the past wife, knowing that the loss of the beloved first wife opened love again for her. The camera is trained on the dog on the door, no one in the frame, only the dog sleeping, and then finally, I see this was to surprise you, filming your arrival, the dog's delight. Only now, 6 years distant, can this seem scripted, meant, the long blank minutes she waited, absent, but there, behind the lens, as though she directs me to notice the motion of her chest in the rise and fall of the frame, and here to understand the one cough, nothing, the clearing of her throat. Then at last you come home to look into the camera as she holds and past her into me, invisible, unimagined other who joins her in seeing through our transience the lasting of desire. This poem is much more deeply satisfying than Phoenix. The individual lovers will fade away to be replaced by others, who will be replaced by yet others. The lovers are transient, but love and desire itself will endure. And the poem touches on both the deeply personal nature of love and the impersonal nature of desire, as the husband looks past his wife into his invisible, unimagined new wife. Late Wife was followed in 2012 by Secure the Shadow, and the title both makes clear Claudia's poetic subject project and acknowledges its precariousness. Sure, securing the shadow may be all that can be accomplished by an art, but a shadow is better than erasure. The harrowing title poem draws on J. Ruby's equally harrowing 1995 book, Secure the Shadow, Death and Photography in America, which examines the memorial photos taken of the recently dead, often children, at a time when photography studios were rare. As Claudia's epigraph informs us, Secure the Shadow ere the substance fade was a popular daguerreotypist's advertising slogan for the making of post-mortem images of loved ones. The photo opens with a description of a child whose mother has taken his body to a studio to be photographed. And if there's anything more disturbing to contemplate than a dead child, it's a mother who has lugged his body some distance to have a remnant of his substance preserved on film. And this isn't on your sheet. It appears at first glance to be an infant, asleep before the fact of death is clear, a boy who still looks like a girl, his mother loath to cut his light, fine hair, laid out on a couch, its back of ornate, dark carved wood, all there is of the room, which very well could have been the photographer's studio she had traveled to. How far? With the body. The photo contains the whole of it. He wears a white gown that might have been for the christening, no shoes, his plump hands posed, folded, dimpled, the hands of a healthy child, the face still round with baby fat. Whatever took him then, took him quickly. Whooping cough, pneumonia, a fever, something common that left no mark. And while the posture is of sleep, the heavy-lidded inward gaze of the eyes, not quite closed, makes no pretense of it. She might have lived to be one of the women expressionless in other photographs. She might have borne other children who lived, and in surviving her, let go this image they must have feared. And so with some reluctance, I purchased this further removal from them, from her, making mine this orphaned but still secure correspondence with all that is about to disappear. Claudia buys J. Ruby's book of photos, or perhaps one of several other museum catalogs of such images, but only reluctantly, because doing so takes the image of the beloved child further from the loving mother, who is by now dead herself. The poem assures us that the correspondence of photograph to living child is secure, though it's an orphaned correspondence. It's at one remove a photographic simulacrum, and at a further remove a photo of a dead child who is soon to disappear into his grave, leaving the photo in the hands of a woman who has herself since died. In the sixth and final section of the poem, Claudia reflects on the task of looking at photograph after photograph of the lovingly posed dead. Too many, then, for such close study, like the living, they become alike, or of a type, the infant twins in a shared casket, the mother and child, the living brother made to pose touching the shoulder of the other. There are, after all, only so many frames, rooms and windows, cradles and caskets, encased within these smaller chambers, crafted of gold, silver, and skeletal leaves. Only so many ways to look into the light, until the light changes, fades, is lost. The pain, the lens, the darkening from glass to mirror, until the substance of the eye sees itself outside the self, and then can see no further. The stunning understanding that ends the poem, seeing the dead body as an artifact, a thing, is a sadly logical conclusion. It's a place that, as the critic Gerald E. Hogel notes, other elegists have come to. We should remind ourselves about what the graveyard poets suggest and what the elegy vividly shows us as early as Theocritus, that death for any specter, from close friend to more distant observers, is already an image, even if it is a corpse, a figure from which at least some of its past substance and active history have been withdrawn, however much interpretive readings of this figure work to reinvest it with those lost contexts. Once death has produced a figure, this image is always already starting to be contextualized by whatever conventions are brought in to read it, in order to establish the ongoing significance of, and thus to fill in the absence that the figure is now interpreted as having once represented. But Claudia takes the logic even further to its only conclusion, seeing herself dead. The eye sees itself outside the self and then can see no further. This is not a strange leap as it might at first seem. In a poem everybody already knows, Emily Dickinson has already gone there. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable, and then it was there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And when the windows and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. The epigraphs of her last three books make it clear Claudia was reading Dickinson for sustenance, for a sense of the vibrant moment, a sense of eternity, and a sense of her role as poet while she confronted the cancers that ultimately took her life. The Opposite House, her penultimate book, quotes Dickinson 3 times, including "A wounded deer leaps highest." In her penultimate book, Impossible Bottle, I got that wrong. Claudia looks on her betraying body as the source of joy that it is, as well as the death its death may or may not inflict on the soul, and she tallies up those wounds. You all may find these poems Gothic. I don't find them so. You may find them morbid, but again, I don't find them that. The anatomy lesson. You didn't know what to do with the wisdom teeth, so you saved them for a while for nothing, or what to think of the ganglion cyst, smooth, benign, they removed from the wrist just above the pulse. And then there was the first biopsy of the cervix, a plug the size of a pencil eraser, they said, and that mole you'd had all your life, they all of a sudden called suspicious, and the nuisance the gallbladder became, and the thyroid gland. The sense of humor and the sense of looking at the self as another are very fascinatingly she makes the impossible look rather easy. But it is the tumor in the gut that gets everyone's attention, its slow, mute explosion in the liver. This time, you are the anatomy lesson, your surgery, a sharper degree of difficulty, starched, bleached, their names newly stitched on crisp lapels. The medical students file in and listen. They write things down. They observe the operation. There is a quiz, a test. You are the exam, what they can access of you. Theater now in the surround. You are the text, the close reading and radical revision, the offensive part lifted out and taken away in a pan, fetus-like, brain-like, that kind of measure, that kind of heft. Only they can tell you when you return to them what you can live without, what regenerates, and on hearing it, you feel a lightening, the way a snake must on slipping through its discarded mouth into another year, or knowing nothing of a year into time itself. Through the mouth, the organ of expression, the self moves into time, which is both the living moment and the living moment so intense it seems to be outside of time. As T.S. Eliot wrote, only through time, time is conquered. The worm is no longer the conqueror worm, but a snake that regenerates itself. Her final book in the poem on leaving the body to science, Claudia goes further still. She sees herself transforming from being to thing. The my becomes a the, becomes the state's, the coroner's, something assignable by me alone, though it will not be the I am on leaving it, no longer to be designated human or corpse. Cadaver it will be, nameless patient stored in the deep hold of the hospital, as in the storage of a ghost ship run aground. The secret in it, that will, perhaps, stir again the wind that failed. It will be pickled, kept like larva, like a bullet sealed gleaming in its chamber. They will gather around it, probe and sample, argue, then return it to its between world, remove their aprons and gloves and stroll some evenings a city block for a beer, a glass of chilled white wine. Even there, they will continue to speak of it, what they glean from beneath the narrative of scars, surgical cavities, the wondrous mess it became before I left it to them with what's left of me, this name, a signature, a neatened suture, perfect, this last selfish stitch. Her signature on the document willing her body to science, the last selfish stitch, is heartbreakingly the clinging to selfhood at the moment of extinction and finding the desire to live selfish. These late poems are rich, rich, rich with echoes of Emerson and Dickinson, elaborations and extensions, arguments and agreements. If Dickinson is a touchstone, Ralph Waldo Emerson is the presiding guide, the Virgil leading her beyond space and time, where Claude, her father, is. Many passages from Ralph Emerson would suffice to open doors into Claudia's late poems, but this one from Immortality will serve. Is immortality only an intellectual quality, or shall I say only an energy that passes, that only an energy, there being no passive? He has it, and he alone, who gives life to all names, persons, things, where he comes. No religion, not the wildest mythology, dies for him. No art is lost. He vivifies what he touches. Future state is an illusion for the ever-present state. It is not length of life, but depth of life. It is not duration, but a taking of the soul out of time, as all high action of the mind does. When we are living in the sentiments, we ask no questions about time. The spiritual world takes place. That which is always the same. But we see how the sentiment is wise. Jesus explained nothing, but the influence of him took people out of time, and they felt eternal. A great integrity makes us immortal. An admiration, a deep love, a strong will arms us above fear. It makes a day memorable. We say we lived years in that hour. Ralph Emerson's thoughts and phrasing in this one passage run, skeptically examined through Claudia's late work. She grapples with the hope that no art is lost, that all time and the spiritual world are ever present in the eternal moment, that there is permanence beyond the mutability we perceive around us, and that, for this poet who died before she was 60, it is not length of life, but depth of life that leads to immortality. Nowhere are these issues more carefully and elegantly scrutinized than in Flocking Theory, a poem that vivifies what it touches. At dusk each winter evening, in the half hour before they must relinquish sky to night, starlings quicken, flock in forms, symmetries shifting, the likenesses so fast and fluid, I can't hold on to anyone before it dissolves into another. And I have taught myself to accept the seamless recreations not as uneasy whimsy, but as the musing of a lucid soul or the disclosures of God. The wind itself made seen, the shade a shadow casts. No one knows for certain what controls this. The flock moving by space measured and kept, strict distances between the bodies. But the birds, I like to think, are having none of the theory anyway, whatever it may be, none of me, abandoning themselves instead to the invariable bliss of what is, the fact of flying manifest in every changing figure, one enormous wing, a waterfall of bees, a murmurous curtain falling to rise as smoke, a funnel cloud, helix, an arm, its empty sleeve. In the inevitable bliss of what is, Claudia celebrates the joy of the fact of flying manifest in every changing figure. The starlings are, in sound, a waterfall of bees, and to the eyes they are simultaneously that ominous falling curtain, but the falling curtain immediately becomes a list of ascending things, smoke as from a fire, a destructive yet magnificent funnel cloud reappearing from her first book, the helix that evokes both the spiral stairway and DNA, an arm that I think of as Claudia's own arm, and the sleeve that clothed that absent arm and now remaining reminds us of it. Claudia tells us that she has educated herself, trained herself, schooled herself. It was not a natural discovery to accept the starling's seamless recreations, not as uneasy whimsy, but as the musings of a lucid soul or the disclosures of God. In that understanding, she tells us how she came to find an order in her life and in her loss of life. And she gives us the opportunity, as much as we may not want it, to share that understanding of her life, her death, and her body of work, her living corpus, as the musings of a lucid soul or the disclosures of God. Claudia Emerson.